requests and responses in Django. A fundamental function of any website or web application is receiving requests and returning responses. Requests and responses in a Django implemented website go through two phases, the request phase and the response phase. Each phase has several steps. Understanding these steps, how they work, and what they can do will give you insight into how various parts of Django work. The request phase. The first stage of a request is the web server. Regardless of which web server you use, a web server's primary function is to accept a request and to figure out what to do with it. Early web servers simply mapped a request to a file and returned the file's contents. It is still very useful to configure the web server to do that with your site's media, such as images, scripts, and style sheets. Most current web servers now allow you to pass a request to a script or other process. In a Django-based site, we'll configure the web server to route requests to a script that implements the Web Server Gateway Interface, or WSGI. WSGI is a Python specification that maps the HTTP request into Python objects and executes a stack of one or more applications. The WSGI application at the bottom of the stack in our site is Django. WSGI applications above Django in the stack are called middleware. The Python object is passed through the stack where the middleware can pre-process the request. While it isn't typical to use WSGI middleware in Django projects, you can use them for some very low-level operations like logging. The first thing Django does with the request is wrap it in its own HTTP request object. Anything in Django that deals with a request uses this HTTP request object. Before processing the request, Django emits the request started signal. This signal is subscribable by applications to do things before anything else. For example, Django uses this signal to clear out its log of database queries executed. Django then passes this request through the middleware stack. Now let's do a quick aside about Django middleware. Django middleware is a class that implements one or more of the following functions: process request, process view, process template response, process response, and process exception. The middleware classes are arranged as an ordered stack. Each of the functions is called at different times and in different orders. In the request phase, they are called in ascending order. In the response phase, they are called in descending order. Now back to the Django request phase. Django executes the process request method, if implemented, of each of the middleware classes in ascending order. The process request method is typically used in two ways: to add to the HTTP request object or to preemptively return a response. You should consider most of the default attributes read-only, but you can add attributes. For example, Django Session middleware adds a session attribute, and the authentication middleware adds a user attribute to the request. You may want to preemptively return a response, like Django's common middleware does, redirecting the user to a different URL if it's missing a slash at the end of the request, or denying the request based on one of the HTTP headers. If your process request method does return a response, no further process request methods are executed in the middleware stack, and the response immediately goes to the process response step discussed later. After Django has executed the process request methods of its middleware stack, it loads its URL configuration patterns. The default URL configuration is defined in the project settings and is typically URLs. However, if one of the middleware's process request methods adds a URL-conf attribute to the request, Django will use it instead. The URL configuration is a hierarchical list of regular expressions used to route a requested path to a view. An entry in the URL configuration could be specific, like, if the request is for About Us, use the About Us view. The root URL configuration can specify a very generic pattern like any request that starts with blog, and instead of specifying a view, it can specify another URL configuration to continue the matching. This allows loose coupling between the project and the individual Django applications. You can capture parts of the URL regular expression that are passed as positional arguments or keyword arguments of the view as well. Once the URL configuration matches the requested path with a view, it's back to the middleware stack to call each class's process view method. The process view step allows middleware classes to inspect the view that Django is going to execute and the arguments it will pass. You can alter the arguments or return your own response. Django's own cross-site request forgery middleware uses process view to check if the view has an attribute marking it exempt from checks. A final step in the request phase is the view. In the simplest sense, a view is a callable Python object that accepts an HTTP request object and returns an HTTP response object. Views might also accept arguments that are derived from parts of the request path. The response phase. The view handles all the business logic, which is different from the presentation logic handled by the template. Business logic decides what data can be shown, while the presentation logic decides if and how the data is presented. The view finds all the data required for the response and performs any actions necessary. The data is put in a context dictionary. The view can do one of two things. It can either render the template itself and return it within an HTTP response, which will skip the next step, or it uses the template response, which allows for the next step, process template response middleware. If the HTTP response object returned by the view has a render method, like the template response does, Django calls the process template response method for each middleware class in reverse order. The middleware can alter the context data or the template. It can return its own HTTP response as well. Next, we will render the template. Regardless of whether the view rendered the template or Django called their response's render function, the process is the same. A template is converted into the final response. Template rendering involves a template and a context dictionary. A simple template might just have variables that are substituted with the values associated with that key in the context. More complex templates can introspect the context to decide how to play the data intelligently. Templates have access to filters used to provide special formatting to data and template tags, which can do just about anything. Filters and template tags are custom Python code, so you can enforce any business rules. For easier management, templates can extend and include other templates. Finally, Django goes through the middleware stack one more time in reverse order, calling each class's process response method. The process response method of the middleware stack is always executed when any part of Django returns an HTTP response object. The process response method must return an HTTP response object even if it is just the same object passed to it. It can alter the existing response, or it can make its own instead. After the middleware is finished with the response, Django emits a request finished signal, similar to the request started signal emitted at the beginning of the request phase. Applications can subscribe to this signal to handle any cleanup tasks, like Django does. Django then converts its HTTP response object into the appropriate WSGI response and returns that back through the WSGI stack. If any WSGI middleware is used, it can alter the responses as necessary. Finally, the WSGI response is returned to the web server. The web server converts the WSGI response into its own native format and passes it back to the user. In summary, the entire process looks like this. The user makes a request, which the web server receives and passes on to the WSGI application stack in Django. Django emits the request started signal before sending the request through the middleware stack calling the process request method. Next, Django loads its URL configuration and figures out which view to execute. This information is sent through the middleware stack calling the process view method. Django calls the view, which returns a response. If the response is a template response, the response goes through the middleware stack in reverse order, calling the process template response method. Django calls the template responses render method to render the template if the view has not rendered the template before returning its response. The final response goes through the middleware again in reverse order, calling the process response method. Django emits the request finished signal just before Django sends its response back through the WSGI stack. The WSGI stack hands off the response to the web server, which sends it to the user. I hope you've enjoyed this training video. Look for more to come soon.